How are you guys? Welcome back to Wargaming China. As you can see in front of you are three Soukouteis armoured motorboats of the IJA. I built them myself using wood, cardboard, construction waste, things I find, general bits and bobs, and bits from my spares box. Now, the reason I built Soukouteis was I had to build one for the Japanese Army's amphibious operations during the January 28th incident. So I needed one for that, and whilst I built that, because when I sit and build something, I look at the pictures, I keep reading articles about it, I do all my research, I double check facts, because it's a long process, and a lot of the time I'm waiting for materials to set, or indeed sometimes when I make a model I might spend an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours looking at a piece of timber and thinking, where's the best cut, where, there's a lot of, when I build a model I don't build it from a design. I did build these models a little bit shorter than they should be. They're 20mm, so they say I built them at 176. I still made each vessel a couple of centimeters too short, just for the sake of storage and table space. But it's hardly noticeable. So I'm going to talk about Soukouteis and the Imperial Japanese Army. Now, if you watched the last episode I did about the IJNLF, I stated that by 1928 the Imperial Japanese Army was already ahead of the Imperial Japanese Navy in terms of amphibious operation capability and technology and competency. As we can see, what we have to remember when we look at the Soukouteis is the original designs for the Soukouteis. We'll take, for instance, the very first Soukouteis built, the Sekigaki. Okay, I'll move these out of the way and let's focus on the Sekigaki. Now, in 1927, the Japanese Army decided that it needed its own amphibious warfare capability, and especially amphibious assault capability. The Japanese Army in 1928 had begun to build the Shimshu Maru, which is a landing craft carrier, or an amphibious assault support vessel. Now, the lines of this ship and the capability of this ship are actually quite staggering, because she could carry I think it was 36 landing craft she could carry, the Shimshu Maru. But as well as landing craft, what the Japanese Army put out specs for was for an armoured motorboat that could escort the landing craft almost to the beaches and deliver fire support on the spot. Now, in terms of doing this and putting a specs for this ship to be carrying 30 landing craft, I mean, I've had a couple of beers, but I think it's about 30 landing craft and 4 of these Soukouteis. That's quite an amphibious capability. Also, there was a seaplane tender built aboard the ship too. She was a very bulky ship, but the lines of which, if you're lucky enough to live in a harbour city where your Navy bases itself, which Sydney is a beautiful city, and the Royal Australian Navy has a lot of ships always in port, and the modern lines of their amphibious assault carrier, amphibious assault support vessels, and the Shimshu Maru are just very similar. The Shimshu Maru was the first ever type of vessel in this, you know, with the flood deck, cranes, gantries, everything. I mean, I want you to go and look up the Shimshu Maru. And now let's remember, the Shimshu Maru is an army ship. Now, a lot of historians will feel and tell you that, well, a lot of historians will state in their works that the Japanese army was always expansionist towards the Pacific, you know, that the capabilities of the Japanese army ship, the Shimshu Maru, was for long distance amphibious operations, and indeed she could do it, she was capable of it. But really, when you're looking at the Shimshu Maru, you've got to remember that even in 1928 the Japanese were looking at China, and not only were they looking at the coast, but they were looking at the mighty rivers of China. And let's remember, the Yangtze River can be more than 30 miles wide at some points. So when you are, it's not, we cannot oversimplify how the difficulties of amphibious operations along these rivers. Now, the Shimshu Maru was in combat in the January 28th incident when she launched her boats for the IGA amphibious troops, along with supported by the Soukouteis Kachidoki during the 1928 incident. Now, I'll come back to that, but that's why I started to build the Soukouteis. Okay, so the Japanese army had put down specs. Two companies replied to the specs. One at Ujina finished first, and the Soukouteis was model number 1 prototype. She had a 37mm gun in a bow turret, a 6.5mm Type 3 in a turret in front of the wheelhouse, and a 6.5 Type 3 medium machine gun in a turret on the rear. She was she could do 11.5 knots, which is very underpowered. To be honest, the Japanese army, it's obvious the Japanese army designed this ship. It's top heavy. It's packing too much into too short a space. She's 14.4 meters long. She weighs 16 tons. And instead of armor, and this was an interesting thing I found when I started researching the Soukouteis, the armor is nickel chrome. Now, it's not a steel that I'm not a metallurgist, and I don't know much of the properties of nickels except for rust proofing. And to be honest, it was the first time I'd found nickel chrome armor mentioned when I had looked during my research in the Pacific, you know. And I've been a wargamer for a long time, you know, face hardened steel, homogeneous steel, armoured plate, boilerplate. I mean, we come across all of those types of armour, but it was the first time for me personally I came across nickel chrome armour. So I feel that the Japanese army was thinking, it wanted these boats in service for a long time. It wanted them seaworthy, i.e. they must have cost a lot of money to be using so much nickel chrome, because nickel is not a cheap mineral. And the result was the Sakigake. Now, the Sakigake, as I said, was designed for the Shimshu Maru. She was designed to fit through the divot so that she could be fitted back into the boat, and to fit the width for the rollers on the top deck so she could roll down into the cargo well, into the flood deck. So she was built to the same specs, but I think when we look at those specs, we've also got to remember that the Shimshu Maru wasn't launched until 1931. So the Japanese army is experimenting for the first type of boat for the job that it wants the boat to do on the Shimshu Maru. I'm sorry if that got, yeah. So the Japanese army is looking for a vessel to deploy from the Shimshu Maru. The Shimshu Maru was not built by the time the first Soukouteis was, and the Japanese army, even though it was a prototype boat, didn't like it. Too top heavy, too slow. The 37mm Type 22 infantry gun, which is referred to as a sniper gun. If you ever see references to sniper gun, 37mm sniper gun, that's what they're talking about. That's what they mean, the Type 22 37mm infantry gun. So she was good. She was in service because there was nothing better. These boats were in demand. The Japanese would build nearly 57, I think, different Soukouteis, and each one would get a number. And that's the only differentiation in them. There's no, as far as I can see, there's no types, there's no class. They're just all Soukouteis, and they're known by the model number is the year that they're launched, and there are many variations in the design. So what we've got is the Sakigake, built first, launched 1928, an unsatisfactory design. So then the Japanese army thought, okay, well we do have another one, because Ujina Shipworks made the Sakigake, and I think it was Ishiwijima shipbuilders that built the Kachidoki. Now, there's a lot of contradictions about these boats. I'm going to bring the Sakigake back, because the Kachidoki, her name means battle cry. And the Sakigake, her name is either translated as presto, or, hang on, it says on the bottom, or pioneer. So she was a prototype. And, you know, there are conflictions over her name, which is true for the whole story of the Soukouteis. So we'll move that away. So then they went to the 20-meter long Kachidoki. This time, a Type 90 57mm gun, the same as what would go in the Otsu. And Chiha, 57mm gun, in a forward turret, in a bow turret. Single, Type 3. Look, some Type 89 7.7mm gun in the forward turret in front of the wheelhouse, and on the stern another Type 89 7.7mm gun on the wheel in a turret. Now again, even though the Kachidoki was a better balanced ship than the Sakigake, the Japanese army was still not really that happy with the design. Now, because the Sakigake weighed 14.5 tons, and the Kachidoki weighs 20 tons. She's made of the same. She's got the same chrome nickel armor. We have to question whether the specs for the davits that she was supposed to be hauled back on board for. Well, we have to question, because, you know, how do I put this, not being the world's best communicator, but we have to question what the load capacity was for the specs, because that's a big gap, isn't it? 14.5 tons to 20 tons. So that's 5.5 tons extra weight, and it's supposed to go back on the same part of the ship and be hauled up by the same and lowered on the same mechanisms. So I think maybe the Japanese army were kind of doing what I do when I build a model. They were feeling their way through it. So they didn't. So when they were building and probably that's why they got such a good ship as the Shimshu Maru, because, you know, they didn't. It doesn't seem to me that they were doing a diagram and then sticking to it. The design was evolving even as they were building the ship, because the Soukouteis are built for that ship, and the design of them is evolving, and the weights and capacities and dimensions of those boats are ever changing too. So the Kachidoki at 20 meters and 20 tons is the first Soukouteis to see combat. She'll support the troops with close-in fire support during the Liuhe landings. And the Japanese will again not really be impressed with the design, you know. They'll still label this as an experimental. Now, they'll build another experimental boat with the same armament, but the top turret they'll make the same. See, it's a very confusing subject because they're all just bloody numbers. Okay, the third one was also an experimental. I do have some notes here. The third one was also experimental. It got the same amount of armament as number 2 as the Sakidaki, but it got a bigger engine. Now these boats all had a crew of 10. Some figures will say 12, 13. So, you know, 10 I think. The bigger boats, definitely 13, but I'll get to them. So then you go to the Soukouteis class number 4, which was like the first one built that doesn't have a prototype attached to it, prototype tag attached to it. Now, again, you're talking 57 millimeter bow gun in a turret, and then they'll switch to twin light machine guns in a wheelhouse turret and a stern turret, but they won't change the armor. The armor will stay in nickel chrome. So it seems that the Japanese army were. So remember, this is 1933, and there's still no. They're still getting the same steel. There's no fighting with. They're getting enough steel for their projects in 1933. So they're obviously happy with the nickel chrome armor, and I think this is because if we look at what opposition they faced at Liuhe. Sorry to people from China for my terrible pronunciations. But if we look at the Japanese landing at Liuhe, and they're facing the 19th Route Army, or they're facing troops manning some of the Wusong guns, you're looking at troops, Chinese using the old Hanyang rifles, and this is round nose ammo. And to be honest, this nickel chrome armor probably would have been good enough for troops firing round head slugs, even 7.92 Mauser round head, because it's the ballistics of the bullet. It just does not help it penetrate armor. So I think, you know, in the 1932 landings and probably through the early 30s, the nickel chrome armor would have been good enough. And whether they replaced it because of cost, I don't know, because they've built nearly 27 boats with the nickel chrome armor. So the last one that I built was the Model 39. Now, as I said, the Model 39, launched in 1939, was designed that the Japanese would continue to play with, but basically a lot of the features of the boat, such as the rounded cutout bow and the 57mm on the front, and just the layout of the boat would remain the same, but the armament would change. Some of these were armed with twin 13mm auto cannons in open casemates here, or indeed some had 3 all in turrets. As I said, the Japanese built a lot of different types of Soukoutais. Now, I want to go back to the rivers of China and state that by 1936, all different types of model of Soukoutais were patrolling the rivers of China for the Japanese army. Now that's why a lot of the things said about this boat discussed that it's a river patrol boat. It was never designed for river patrol boat. As I said, it was designed to give close-in support during amphibious operations. But as I said about the Shimshu Maru, the design and requirements for the Soukoutais progressed as the time they were in service did so. So by 1943, you will see, especially in the Philippines, Soukoutais escorting landing craft doing supply runs. So the Soukoutai had gone from being built to be deployed from the Shimshu Maru as an amphibious support vessel, and then she had been put on as a river gunboat, and then finally she was doing short run escort on short run supply convoys of, only small convoys, but it was very important work for the Japanese. So the Soukoutai for the Japanese war effort was a very important vessel. I'll be using these I'll be using some for Jitra, Malaya, the invasion of the Philippines, New Georgia. This is all the combat that they saw a lot of combat. Of course, the rivers of China, because I war game mainly in China. So these boats served until 1945. It was only with the Type 39, the Model 39, that they've got armoured plate, and that was face hardened Japanese armour, 6mm of it. Now, 57mm gun on the front, 57mm gun on the back. Range of about 400 miles on the final types of Soukoutais. So they were useful for small island replenishment, of garrisons. As I said, they're all scratch built, and the Japanese had a lot of variations of the type. As I said, they built nearly over 57 of them. So there's lots of different variations within them. Where if you're a purist and you do know these boats, you will see that I've made a few errors in their build, but that's more down to my I'm still learning. When it comes to scratch building, it's a learning process. So this boat, I think I got it dead right. These two, this one, Sekigake, I got 80% right. The Kachidoki, I probably got about 80% right. I'm not they're not models, they're for the wargaming table, so they have to be able to take a knock and be picked up and down, so they are simplified. That's it. So you'll be seeing the Kachidoki in an amphibious assault as soon as I get my table together. Just because I've waffled on a bit, I'll show you my table now. So this is how my game's been going. I'm still working on it as a scenario, so I've got to finish this game before I start Liu Hei landings. Okay, I hope you liked that. I hope I didn't ramble too much for you. If I didn't, press like please, and if you like what I do, press subscribe. Always remember, the Chinese soldier fought with the least for the longest. Take care.